Brief introduction. So this is a jointly hosted webinar. The Southwest Fire Science Consortium has a webinar series, and so we sort of fit right into that. But it's motivated by the Burned Area Learning Network. So I'll talk about sort of both networks here just to try to make some connections and give a little orientation. So the Southwest Fire Science Consortium is part of a network of consortia of knowledge exchanges across the country. And we're glad to have folks from anywhere in the country, but you should also connect with your local knowledge exchange because they'll have local events that may be of interest to you. And I've just put a poll up to give us some sense of who's on the line here and where they're calling in from. Looks like most folks are calling in from the Southwest, which is appropriate given the focus here today. And I'll share that in just a second here. So just a little bit of background on the fire science exchanges. And this is basically true of the exchanges across the country, but obviously I'm speaking from the Southwest. The goal of these knowledge exchanges is to share fire science research and information across the boundaries that we create for ourselves. So sometimes those are agency boundaries, administrative units, or even just state boundaries. So looking at, say, Arizona, New Mexico, sometimes it's hard to make connections across those state lines when really shouldn't be. Certainly fire doesn't think about those boundaries. And a lot of the information, what we learn in one place is really applicable for another. Another aspect of how we think about sharing information is trying to share across the jobs we hold. So managers, scientists, policymakers, sometimes it's difficult to get information from one group to another. And so that's another one of our goals today and throughout the exchange. I've posted another poll here about the kind of organization you work for. And it looks like we've got nice diversity, a number of folks from the federal government, but also from tribes, state, local, university, like myself, NGOs. So that's great because we need all of us working together to solve these kinds of problems. So I'll share this poll as well so you get a sense of who's on the line here. How do we try to do this? Well, normally we do workshops and field trips. We've been relying a little bit more on our webinars lately because of COVID. If you have ideas for events or ways to connect, ways to share information, please let us know because we do within the consortium, we have a little bit of financial support that we can use to rent vans or something like that. It's not enough to put on a full-blown conference, but it's enough to sometimes rent a space, which sometimes is all you need to tip the scale. And then I want to change gears and talk just a little bit about the Burned Area Learning Network. So one of the reasons we're focused today on the East Jemez landscape is because of the thinking around how do we respond to the increase of large, high-severity fires across the West? And so the mission of the Burned Area Learning Network, which is sort of part of the wider fire learning network that the Nature Conservancy runs, is to work collectively to accelerate learning, share knowledge and practices to improve social and ecological outcomes following a wildfire in a changing world. So, this is an example of the power of these learning networks, taking learning from one place to another and really trying to share that information. So it's a pretty parallel to the fire science networks, which is why we're partnering up on this. And I think this is obvious to everybody on this call, probably what drew you to today's call, but I think it's really important as we think about post-fire landscapes in a climate change world, that we acknowledge that they are very complex, and you could even argue more complex than the fire itself or suppressing a high severity fire itself, in part because of the both acute and chronic impacts. the effects on communities as well as ecosystems, and then also this overlapping and confusion around response over those short and long terms. That was sort of the motivator to think about a learning network framework for post-fire. And we put together this graphic thinking about, this is really this cycle. You know, we all know now that we have to think about fires in this before, during, and after context. I like to have a little bit more optimistic images behind there with communities engaged, at least in Ponderosa Pine, low severity fires burning, and sort of afterwards having this nice heterogeneous impacts. But of course, that's not the way many fires burn. And I think with that, well, I guess I should say one last thing, that if the Burned Area Learning Network is of interest to you and you want to stay engaged, and this whole topic of post-fire and all its different elements are something that is really motivating to you, please get in touch with me. You can let me know either in the chat window or dropping me an email. My email probably was in some of the materials you got, but I'll also put that in the chat window. So with that, I will end my sharing and make way for our presenters. And while Colin is getting his presentation up, I will take the opportunity to do some introductions. We have two presenters today. We have Sasha Shorts, who is a program manager for the National Forest Foundation, where she administers the Northern Arizona Forest Fund and works with Arizona and New Mexico to build partnerships to implement watershed, recreation, and forest health projects on national forest lands. Previously, she was leading collaborative planning program at Northern Arizona University, where she facilitated multi-stakeholder collaboration planning projects focused on adaptation to climate change, co-management, and restoration. Sasha holds a master's degree in environmental science and policy. And obviously this background feeds perfectly into what we'll be talking about today. Similarly, Colin Haffey, who is the Forest and Watershed Health Manager with the Nature Conservancy in New Mexico. He works on the Rio Grande Water Fund, and the goal of the Rio Grande Water Fund is to restore a natural fire regime to forests, build up resilient communities, and provide water for 1 million people, including me. So I'm thankful for his work on the Rio Grande Water Fund. His other conservation work focuses on forest restoration, reversing post-fire ecological type conversion, and helping communities prepare for and respond to climate change-driven disturbances. So you can see how their backgrounds lead perfectly into the topic we'll be talking about today. And with that, I will turn it over to Colin, and I'll keep an eye on the chat window. So if you have comments or questions, please feel free to put those in. And otherwise, Colin, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much, Xander. I hope everybody can see my screen and can hear me reasonably well. So thank you. I think as we go through this presentation, I really want to, maybe it's the season, or maybe it's just the duration of this project, but I think part of what I'm hoping to do today is express a lot of gratitude for all of the people who have helped on this project. And so we'll get into some of the specifics on this, but we've been working on the East Jemez Landscape Futures project really for almost 5 years now. And like Xander said, it is a combination of local networks along with the regional networks of the Southwest Fire Science Consortium and the Burned Area Learning Network. But before we get into the details on the project, I did just want to acknowledge that the area that we are working in the East Jemez is the ancestral homelands of many indigenous people in northern New Mexico, including several of our Pueblo partners who are involved in this project. The land I'm standing at now in Santa Fe is ancestral territory and current homeland to many Pueblo partners. And Sasha sits in Flagstaff, Arizona with, homeland of the Hopi and Navajo. So we acknowledge those friends and partners and appreciate the knowledge that they've shared with us, and hope to continue this partnership into the future. In addition to our Pueblo partners, like I said, we have a lot of people who have put literal sweat, blood, in some unfortunate cases, you know, lots of tears in receiving Zoom invites and 3-hour workshops from Sasha and I when we were able to get together, and you know, funding to support this work. So thank you to all of those partners who've contributed hours, funds, and brain energy. The area that we're working on and focusing on today is in northern New Mexico, just northwest of Santa Fe, outside of the small community of Los Alamos, in the Jemez Mountains. You know, the Jemez Mountains are a sky island in, you know, a sort of a disjunct portion of the Rocky Mountains, for those of you unfamiliar. And they've seen their fair share of high severity fire. So this map's a few years old. It doesn't have some of the more recent fires on it, but it definitely shows kind of the distribution of fire across the state, and a large concentration of that in northern New Mexico and the Jemez Mountains specifically. So a zoom in to show the political landscape. It's a pretty complicated geography. We have Park Service in the center, Forest Service in that green, tribal communities in the yellow, the private land in the National Lab, and then we have BLM. So lots of land owners, lots of you know, priorities that overlap, lots of priorities that compete. So complicated, but again, not unlike a lot of geographies across the West. We are talking a lot about recovering from post-fire, and recovering specifically from high severity fire, which is, you know, a relatively novel or you know, underrepresented, I guess, fire regime in the dry conifer forests, but, you know, is representative of a century of fire suppression and really fire exclusion that led to the first shift in fire regimes. And so, like many of you, the forests in the Jemez Mountains often look more like this than they do any sort of historical distribution. And of course, that leads to high severity fire, this tree killing fire, which, you know, not only in the Jemez Mountains, but across the West is increasing on an annual basis. So zooming into the Jemez Mountains, the Las Conchas fire is what we'll focus most on. And it's definitely a personal fire, having lived through it. This is a photo that my wife took from our front porch right before she decided to evacuate, which seems like it was the right decision, even though that fire is actually pretty far away. It just looks a lot closer. Kind of going back in time a little bit to show the history of high severity fire in the Jemez Mountains. This is Bandelier. The outline here in white is Bandelier National Monument, and for scale, that's about 30,000 acres. So the red then is tree killing fire. So this is just the high severity fire. So obviously there's a lot of healthy, good fire in between those patches that's not being shown on the map. So this is the decade of the 70s, one fire, 1977. The 80s were actually relatively wet, so we skip over those and go right into the 90s. So you can see some fire here on the northern block. That's Santa Clara Canyon. That's an important canyon for this story. And then west of Bandelier is the Dome Fire in 1996. So adding some more high severity fire to the picture. Then comes Cerro Grande in 2000, prescribed fire that escaped and made the news, and lots of high severity on the fire on the slopes outside of Los Alamos. Then we enter the 2010s with the Las Conchas fire in 2011, and then the little bit there to the west is Thompson Ridge and another fire in the Jemez. So a significant portion of the 153,000 acre Las Conchas fire was high severity or tree killing. And much, again, you can see Santa Clara Canyon in the upper portions of Santa Clara Canyon, in the western slopes of, the west of Bandelier, the eastern slopes of the Jemez Mountains, lots of headwaters. So one of the differences between, one of the striking things about this fire is these fires, plural, is that the fire is actually burning from the top of the watershed all the way to the mouth of the small streams. And so that's causing like catastrophic watershed damage, which is leading to a lot of erosion. And like Xander mentioned, sometimes the post-fire environment is as bad or worse than the actual fire itself. So obviously on these slopes, not much to hold not much to hold water back, not much to hold that momentum. So as many of you all know, we get lots of post-fire debris flow, post-fire flooding off of streams like this. So this is the environment that we're entering into with the East Jemez project and asking the question, what can we do? As we've seen, in many cases, these fires are burning on top of each other. So reburning is a major question. What happens when a second fire comes in and burns over an area that's already been burned once before, especially when you have a fire on top of a high severity footprint? What do those areas look like? This, burned up, and this is what we saw in the Jemez too, was burning in these logs that deadened down and killing any of the natural regeneration, and even in some cases killing the tall trees, the seed sources. Here's just an image, a series of images immediately after the fire, and you can see in this image that those trees in the foreground, the tall mature trees, had survived the 96 dome fire and then had died in the 2011 fire in Las Conchas. And so we're decreasing the spatial heterogeneity, the spatial complexity, and we're increasing the non-forest vegetation cover. So in this case, shrubs, and those shrubs pop right back up. So they're vigorous resprouters. And so coming back with a vengeance. And this, these shrubs now are taller, 10 feet tall in some cases. And so really increasing the competition for any sort of forest regeneration in that area. And again, just a quick time series that shows the year before the fire, a nice happy little stand of conifers reproducing, doing their thing, potentially linking up to, eventually kind of reforesting that area. And then after Las Conchas, well, not so much. So the question here again is, what can we do? What should we do in areas like this? And how do we deal with this, pattern of work? This work's been done by Jonathan Coop, but this pattern is reinforced across the West, where these subsequent fires, especially in the high severity footprint, are pushing away from forests. So the arrows here are all just sort of showing, well, it's moving away from forest into an oak shrub or a grassland and sort of savanna, or into just this kind of scabland ruderal vegetation. So we're pushing against the grain in some of this work to try to do anything. And then on top of that, you put in sort of the common theme of invasive species, non-native species, in this case, smooth brome. And you have another kind of disruption to the system, another species that loves disturbance, and just another challenge for land managers. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Sasha to talk a little bit about the land management aspects of this, starting with the needs assessment.
Thanks, Colin, and thanks everybody for being here today. Yeah, so against this backdrop, it's pretty amazing. It was 5 years ago now. We started having conversations with Bandelier National Monument, as well as other land managers and researchers and stakeholders in the landscape about kind of grappling with what to do in these highly impacted areas. And from those conversations, we kind of constructed this idea of the East Jemez Landscape Futures as a collaborative approach to help guide planning and research efforts and to really build a network. Dealing with these repeat high severity fire and flood events, there was not a lot to go on. And so having having folks learn from each other across jurisdictions and about what was being tried and what the results were felt really important to people. So, you know, the conversation was really grounded in this idea that the scale of these disturbance events really demanded a landscape approach to management, as that map Colin showed earlier. So there's multiple jurisdictions in this landscape, and the idea was that there's this need to kind of be deliberate about decision making. That perhaps a hands-off approach to this landscape was very appropriate, but that folks needed to work together to kind of make decisions intentionally about what was going to happen here. So we conducted a needs assessment by interviewing multiple folks involved in this landscape in order to identify what the information needs and management issues were, what folks were doing or wanted to be doing, and kind of what opportunities folks saw for additional collaboration and coordination, and also just who else should be involved building that network. And we conducted 50 interviews across quite a few organizations that you can see here. And you know, this quote really stood out to us from one of the folks that we talked to, who said, you know, what do you do after the end of the world? This really substantial event. And so really the purpose of these discussions was to identify, are there opportunities to conduct coordinated research and management in these areas? So through those conversations, we kind of heard that folks really thought about this landscape through sort of three focal areas. Those would be the canyon bottoms, these conifer refugia, or areas of unburned trees, and type converted areas, these areas that were coming back as shrubs and grasslands rather than as forests. So in these conversations, we heard that in canyon bottoms, there were some pretty clear strategies to conduct, and in fact, quite a bit of work underway, especially in Santa Clara. So there was an opportunity to learn across land managers about what's being tried. Folks were interested in native fish reintroduction. Can we get some vegetation along the river banks, get the water temperatures cooler, and get some wildlife in there? Interestingly, you know, non-native fish in some cases were wiped out of these streams, making native fish introduction more of a possibility. And then, you know, also from a land management perspective, thinking about the still forested areas at the headwaters of some of these canyons, and the need for the watershed approach, that if these upper areas burned again, then it could wash out any work below. So the need for coordination there. Refugia of trees really were identified as potentially needing treatment, needing thinning or fire to reduce high severity fire risk in those remaining stands. And also as a valued refugia to maintain connectivity and feed source. And in these type converted areas, there's a lot of differences of opinion about kind of what should happen here. And really an opportunity identified to do management in an experimental way, so that there was learning from anything that was done. There are varied perceptions of the fire risk and the new fire regime type in these scrublands. So that was an information needed. And then a lot of interest in doing some tree replanting, especially thinking about those microsites and where trees can survive in this, this harsher landscape. You know, some of the other issues that came up is whether or when assisted migration might be appropriate to kind of accept this as the new vegetation type, or are there active management approaches that can be used to bring in other vegetation types that might be adapted to a hotter, drier future. A big interest in seeing culturally relevant plants on this landscape, concern about erosion and cultural sites, invasive species control, and maintaining wildlife habitat and connectivity. So, you know, the spirit that really came out of these conversations was that there's sort of an opportunity in this area to really try and to learn. You know, if we're managing with uncertainty, we're all comparing notes, then at least we can share information and have a sounding board. And that was really the spirit that has kind of carried us forward since this initial needs assessment. So some of the overarching issues that came up, we kind of touched on these, but they really do apply across the whole landscape and not just to those focal areas. And so again, these are some of the focal areas that have kind of carried through to the projects that have happened since this initial conversation. And, you know, kind of from this, we really wove together a diagram that has lots of words. But the idea that the group wanted to focus on these head converted areas, canyon bottoms, and conifer refugia. They wanted to focus on action, that, you know, there was opportunity to do work in this landscape, but a limit in capacity from both a funding perspective and a time perspective. So as much as the partnership could focus on bringing resources to get work done on the ground, that was advantageous, as well as to have that research coordination to pair the on-the-ground management with research in order to learn and manage uncertainty, and then to really connect this to community outreach. These are places that are important to a lot of people and folks who have been through a lot of these disturbances. So, but there's a lot of opportunity to connect with the community, all towards supporting this deliberate decision-making for future conditions. So kind of from this initial network building, we were lucky to receive a Water Smart Cooperative Watershed Management Program grant. And the purpose of the grant was to develop a watershed group and to support watershed restoration planning and project design. So really has been super valuable in terms of providing support for that kind of group development and planning support. And that also makes groups eligible for implementation funding. So the past year and a half, and Colin will talk more about where we're at, but we've been working with partners to develop priority plans and strategies to benefit lands across the East Jemez. And to do this planning that can increase capacity for fire management, or excuse me, for post-fire management, as well as trainings, workshops, and other outreach efforts. So this is Colin's favorite comic here, just kind of showing the complexity of needing plans when sometimes it can be easier to just go ahead and implement something. And, you know, this effort has included plenty of projects that are already being implemented, even as the strategy is being developed. And I think that points to the, you know, the need to balance being opportunistic and strategic in working in this landscape. And so the intent of the watershed strategy is not to slow down any of the good work that's already happening, but to provide some connection and opportunities to see that full landscape picture and see where the collective priorities are, and if there are opportunities to plug into the work that's already happening. And just kind of one more idea, we often think of ecological systems and their benefits to human communities, the creation or the way they provide resilience to our human communities. And something else that we heard really strongly throughout is the role that our communities play in maintaining resilient systems as well. And this has come up in a number of ways, one of them being the importance of restoration with a focus on the types of plants that are important culturally to maintain and have endure on this landscape.
Great, thanks, Sasha. So I'm just going to walk us through the restoration strategy in the research needs that are still outstanding, as well as kind of walk through a few of the case studies. And again, I wanted to start with a timeline of where we've been, because I think that it's important to put this in the context that this project has been developing over many years. And it started with some field trips to Santa Clara and really learning from them about what the Pueblo was working on in their canyon that has seen a lot of fire. And that workshop was sponsored in part by the Burned Area Learning Network. And then kind of working through this, from the needs assessment through some workshops and field trips to kind of discuss the award from the Bureau of Reclamation in April of 2019, and then we had some field trips with the Burned Area Learning Network. I think a lot of you were on some of those in kind of Flagstaff, New Mexico, and Colorado, all dealing with these issues. And then in 2019, we really dug in and started the actual planning process for this restoration strategy, and had really hoped to have continued field trips and all through the summer and everything, but we all know the trials of 2020. So we weren't able to do a lot of those, but we did have good, get-togethers and workshops over Zoom this summer. And I think that the strategy draft that we have now is in a good place, while there's still room for improvement. It did allow us to, and Sasha will end with this, but to go back to the Bureau of Reclamation for a phase 2 application to put into practice some of the things that we've identified as high priority restoration places and restoration strategies for this work. So, again, from the needs assessment that we completed in 2017, it really comes back to this question: should we act? Should we do anything? I think this is the number one land management question. We've seen the effects of, acting in ways that turned out to be, scientifically or ecologically ill-advised. And so nobody who's a land manager, nobody who advises land managers or wants to be in that position looking back 50 years ago and saying, oh, we shouldn't have done anything. But in this case, we feel like there are opportunities and there is a responsibility in some cases to take action. So all of our action, we all want our action to be science-based, and we all want it to have good scientific framework. And I am a simple person and don't think too complicated, don't think too complexly about stuff or speak super good. So I, think of it like this. If you gotta look at time and then you look at like biomass or, the other forest stuff came from a conversation with Matt Herto as he's helping me through this. But, over time with no intervention, we will increase, our biomass or our forest, whether it's water, whether it's, snow holding capacity, what have you. And the idea is is not to get back to this maximum biomass of 1996. We don't want to get there. That caused a lot of problems. That caused the problems that we're in now. But what we kind of want to do is get somewhere in the middle, right? Where there's, with some intervention, we can increase our biomass, we can increase our water holding capacity, we can increase the water quality. We can do all of those things with some intervention, and it's about identifying the right places for that. And luckily, there's smarter people than me out there who are thinking about this kind of stuff. And so we steal from them, and working with people, this TAM review, I think, of reforestation helped us set the stage for a landscape kind of conversation about where do we take those actions. And for those of you not familiar with this paper, they walked through a decision-making framework that kind of broke the landscape up into these segments, very similar to how the needs assessment in the folks shook out with these ideas of, okay, we have different zones of intervention where there might be a no action zone, there might be a reforestation zone, there might be a wait and see zone, all these kind of things. And I'm not getting the exact zones right from that paper, but it was helpful to sort of say, okay, start with your specific geography and start to cut that up. We've also been building off of, these conceptual frameworks for, what does restoration mean in a changed landscape, in a situation where we have, climate pressure, invasive species pressure, different, land use challenges. And so borrowing from Greg Applett and Peter McKinley, we're working under this, was sort of been tweaked. They call it guide, accept, resist. We call it resist, accept, direct. And this idea is again, it's something that's emerging out of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service as a way to think about how we do restoration work in a changed climate where, processes and function have been altered by climate warming or land use history or a combination. And so this idea of resistance and sort of shifting back towards a historical baseline is part of what we're talking about. This, and then there's this idea of acceptance where it's just with, for multiple reasons or a combination of reasons, you can say, well, we're just going to accept what is there. And again, doing that in a deliberate way is important. And then in some cases, actually directing a system into a new state or into a different state is something that we're trying to talk about and think about. And like any framework, this is good to start a conversation with, but it's not an end all be all. And there's definitely some challenges if you try to sort of stretch it too far. So we kind of kept it at a high level. And what I want to talk about next is just the conversations that we've had over the things on the right. We've kind of talked about the background and the project area, but this is the overall strategy outline for the restoration plan as part of that BOR funded project. And again, a lot of the thanks goes to Savannah, a graduate student at Northern Arizona University. She is working with Claire Aslan on the north side of campus there in Flagstaff, and she's helped us. This wouldn't be in the state that it's in without her, so we have to thank her. I think she's out hiking with her dad on the Appalachian Trail. So she's doing cool things this week, and we thank her for her help. Again, a lot of this project is really, it's hand in hand with the ecological and the social. And so the diagram that Sasha showed with the feedback loops between the ecological community and the adaptation and the restoration pieces of that, the feedbacks between those and the community, everybody's dealing with external factors. All of that stuff I think is built in, or hopefully will be built into this plan at the end. And so our community goals are really about education, about facilitating connections. It's one of the things that we heard over and over again in the needs assessment, that people are feeling like they're severed from their landscape. And then, recreation is an important way to get people back in. And then also our cultural goals coming from, the Hispanic communities that have been in place for a long time in northern New Mexico, and our Pueblo communities, really helping, relying on them to guide us in the cultural restoration. Across ecological types, again, Sasha touched on a lot of this about the cross-cutting issues. So this is being deliberate about where we take action, thinking about maintaining and protecting the less disturbed areas, dealing with invasive species, being science-based, thinking about how climate change, thinking about, sort of the benchmark that we're using is 2100, what will that be like, to sort of set a goalpost. And, you know, again, all of these things kind of get rolled into this resilience framework. So speaking specifically about the different strategies, so we've divided them into two different categories, sort of further kind of binning things to make the plan writing a little bit more simple. But one is, you know, so one area is the uplands. So this is all of the area, you know, that used to be forested and is now in some form or another kind of coming back as shrubland, grassland, or has some refugia, some conifer stands. And so here you can see kind of the big bullet, the high level list of goals that are included in the strategy. And top of the list is managing fire regimes. Those things are shifting. This is where we get into the complicated sort of where the conceptual diagram of resist, accept, direct already kind of falls apart, right? Where you have overlap between them. You have, you know, in some cases we're accepting a new fire regime. In other cases, we're trying to direct a fire regime into a different, you know, some other sort of new system, and in others we're trying to restore the historical fire regime. And that feeds into the refugia protection, understanding that those are our genes, you know, those are the genetic materials, those are the seed sources of the future. In some ways, that's one of the most important resources we have. So that's very much a, you know, a resistance kind of action. Our reforestation is a combination of resist and direct, where in some cases we're trying to replant, you know, the historic conditions. In other cases, we're thinking about maybe it's not assisted migration in the kind of classic sense of the definition, but it's more of a like an assisted range expansion, or we're focusing on the areas of the range that are going to have a higher likelihood of success in that 2100 climate. Invasive species management is very much a resist strategy. And then again, the shrubland and grassland is this combination of acceptance and also kind of directing in combination with the managing of fire. So it gets complicated, but again, that resist, accept, direct framework has been helpful in sort of getting words on the page and getting, you know, it's been a framework, again, a skeleton that we've been able to put our ideas on. And I'm not going to go through this, but this, you know, in detail, but this just shows kind of the complexity of how, you know, making just simple decisions about where to plant trees in the type converted areas or in these post-fire areas is really complicated. And so you have to think about all kinds of different things like, you know, has the type conversion already occurred? Are we looking at microsites? What's the risk of reburn? There's a lot of things on, you know, on here, and there's a lot of things that are sort of left off because they're sort of captured in the inner spaces between the boxes. But that's the complexity of what we're trying to deal with and what managers are dealing with in these landscapes. And similarly, with the canyon bottom strategy, you know, all of the same things come into play. There's fire regimes that are changing that we may want to direct into a certain, you know, into a certain return interval, into a certain season, into a certain size, so that we can foster a fire dependent or a fire resistant native species that may be a little slightly different than what was historically there. All of this is focused on restoring hydrologic function. You know, process and function are the key to keeping this thing moving and keeping this thing away from being like a long gardening project. Revegetation of native plants has both an ecological and a cultural importance. And then similarly, management of habitat for wildlife is critical, because what we, you know, if we can get wildlife in there, especially things like beavers, they will do a lot of the work, quote unquote, for us. And, you know, they're also an indicator of ecosystem health. If you can create habitat that beaver likes to hang out in, likes to build their home in, that's an indicator that we might be on the right track. So again, part of what we wanted to do in this strategy is focus on identifying some of the barriers to implementation, but also thinking about, okay, well, how do we move through that implementation together in a way that we can all learn from each other? And part of that is building capacity, and part of that is identifying funding sources. And then, of course, no plan would be complete without adaptive management. And so this is something that's really important. And this is where I think some of the really great research and science can come into this. So I wanted to just walk through these case studies really quickly in just 2 minutes here. But one of the case studies that we're working on is post-fire reforestation. And again, many people have contributed to this work in identifying where we should be looking at potentially planting some trees. And so we're doing this at the same time that we're planting, with the intent that we can learn in real time and incorporate that knowledge into this strategy and give the strategy a little bit longer shelf life. So again, we're just looking at the high severity fire and have identified the spots on the map that are highest priority. So the warmer colors here are the highest priority for reforestation. And we can bin those out by land management unit and actually look at it and say, these areas have the highest likelihood of being able to survive at 2100 climate for the species that we're looking at, which are Doug fir and ponderosa pine. And here's the places where, planting priority zone 1 is in this purple, 2, 3, and 4 is where we would sort of go in order per management unit. So this is Bandelier. And we're growing out these trees in a small nursery in Mora, New Mexico. It's run by New Mexico State University. It's a tiny little nursery relative to what other people have the capacity for in the Pacific Northwest. But it's really great because it's again, we're working with local community members. Here is a group, Trees Water People, who's working with the Tri-Pueblo Coalition to just do some amazing stuff on the ground, planting trees. And I'm gonna skip ahead real quick so we can jump into the next steps. But I think, again, all of this has the intent of linking together this, making sure that we're community focused, that we're socially focused from the start. So Sasha can talk quickly about phase 2, and then we can open it up for questions and discussion.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, so that Water Smart proposal, that's our phase 1 funding is supporting the kind of strategy phase that we're in right now, and phase 2 is about implementation. So we just worked on a proposal led by Trees Water People on kind of the follow-up to get some hopefully get some resources towards implementation. And these priority areas were identified through the strategy to look at Capulin and Bland canyons, with quite a few partners here to get some work done on the ground. See it. Yeah. So I think hopefully we've left you with the thought that post-fire environments have kind of an opportunity to be considered differently. There's a lot of challenges in working in these systems, but a lot of opportunity to work deliberately and to engage the broader community in restoration efforts, and do some strategic work towards things like planting trees. So is that our last slide, Colin?
Yeah, that's the last one.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks again to everybody who's been a part of this project for the past few years.
Well, and thank you, Sasha and Colin, for your presentation. It's neat to see. I've sort of been aware of different pieces of the project, and it's neat to hear the whole story. So let's see. I'm hoping to get some more questions here in the chat window. We had one come in that's kind of honing in on one specific aspect, I think triggered by some of Colin's comments about vegetation type conversion. But someone asked, does repeat prescribed burning in oak scrub create opening sufficient for trees to get established? Sort of, really honing in. Okay, Colin's throwing up his hands.
Here's what I think. I think so. I think it hasn't, at least in our geography, it hasn't been widely tested. But that's one of the things that we're learning through, this paired planning and action process is it's a challenge to plant trees in areas that have only burned once, because the heavy fuel loading that deadened down all the logs are just, it's hard to get out there. It's just super hard to walk through. It's sort of risky to plant in. We think that these are serving as some sort of nurse structure, so protecting the seedling from hot, dry temperatures. But if a fire comes through and burns, we saw in that earlier image, it can kill the regeneration even if it's older. And so we want to balance that risk. So I think that if you were to burn in oak shrubland, especially if it had a deadened down component to it, you could burn up those logs, reset the shrubland, and then go in and immediately replant. That you might have a nice mix of the oak serving as a facilitator, while not putting at risk the seedling, at least after a few years once the seedling is established. So that's a huge experiment. I think it would be an amazing experiment. I think it has practical applications, and we're going to see what happens as we get sort of the natural experiments that come in with lightning strikes and reburns in those areas.
Yeah, thank you. A great answer to a difficult question. And I think it sort of underscores the challenge of working in a changing climate in a fairly novel environment. And we just need more information, although you guys have a great science team. And then Helen just asked another question with a congratulations on a great project. What are your thoughts on ponderosa pine survival given the current drought conditions, even as transplanted seedlings?
Yeah, that's a challenge. I feel confident about it for 3 reasons. One, we're able to take advantage of planting at the highest elevation of ponderosa pine range. 2, we can really use our planting crew is being led by Santa Clara Pueblo, so there's a lot of local knowledge of just like how the Jemez works, and so identifying those microsites, we're able to take advantage of those. And then 3, we're using, through the nursery program, we're using kind of state-of-the-art nursery practices to grow trees that actually have more of that more connective tissue or transportation tissue. This is where I'm not a scientist, you can tell, but the stuff that moves water up and down, the little vessels and stuff, there's more straws in the tree when you grow them in this way. And so it's about drought conditioning and drought hardening, so that it is demonstrated that those trees have a better chance of survival. So I think in those kind of things, I feel optimistic about it. Would I have liked to actually have seen a monsoon this year during the first year of our planting? Yes, Helen. So if you know how to make the rain come in the monsoons, please send that our way 2021, because it was not pleasant, setting up a reforestation project and looking at bright blue New Mexico skies.
Thank you. Yeah, another good question, a good answer. And I think somewhere we have some of Dr. Owen Burney's talks on that seedling development for sort of harsh sites. And so I may be able to get that in the chat window here if I can. I think we have a recorded webinar maybe. Let's see. Another comment came in from Leah. This is really inspiring work. Are there other priority forests in New Mexico that have experienced similar fire regimes that could be candidates for a similar scale project? And she mentions parts of the Gila Apache Sitgraves.
I'll say NFF does do some work on the Apache Sitgraves, where some of the tree planting, the seed sources for that are thinking ahead with a climate perspective, and that's in partnership with NAU.
Well, and I'll add from the Burned Area Learning Network perspective, this idea of kind of replicating this model. I think on one hand, there are unfortunately a lot of places that could use this model. I was just talking with some folks from Mendocino, California, and they were sort of interested in East Jemez Forest Futures. from the bringing in the community perspective. On the other hand, I think that it's clear this takes a lot of energy, a lot of focus, and unfortunately, there aren't a lot of Collins and Sashas for every community. And so I think it is kind of a challenge for us more broadly as all practitioners in this zone. How can we replicate this? And I think, there's similar questions with fire adapted communities and those sorts of programs where how do you show something works, start to make some progress, and then try to replicate it, because it's not necessarily easy. Another question came in from Scott. Given the efforts in planning presented here, what are the general timelines and vision for planting in the ponderosa pine and mixed conifer zones? Begin in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years? And it sounded like you've already begun, right?
Yeah, our goal is to plant 100,000 trees in by the end of 2021. So we've planted like maybe 13,000. So again, due to a combination of COVID and the non-soon. So we're working on that. And then I think after that, we'll continue to kind of make strategic investments in reforestation, not just in the Jemez, but I think there is a great opportunity to expand, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Four Corners kind of region.
And I think there are some, on the policy level, some optimistic signs with things like the Replant Act that may increase some federal resources for replanting. So,
yeah.
I think we could keep talking about this. There's so many angles to it, but we should probably wind up here. I want to take the opportunity to thank you both again, both for the presentation, but also for the work you're doing on the ground. I think as someone who benefits from the Jemez Mountains in a lot of ways, I appreciate your work. So thank you. And thanks everybody for listening in. As I said, there'll be a recording available. We'll have it on Southwest Fire Science Consortium webpage and probably also the Burned Area Learning Network webpage. And if you have other ideas for future webinars or want to stay in touch, please get in touch. And I think with that, we'll wrap up. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Xander. Thanks to the consortium too for supporting these. Great resource.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks.